Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is the veracity and reliability of VAERS when it comes to reporting on side effects of vaccines. A outbreak of disease very reminiscent of typhoid Maori. COVID levels are increasing and it has some serious concerns attached to it. A preprint regarding the effectiveness of interventions against COVID-19, but specifically in France. The increasing work against Nipah virus in India. A effectively case study of quadruplet children as a result of IVF. The cats are responsible for killing billions of animals in the United States of America. Neuralink begins its first clinical trials and is recruiting. Indoor farms are shutting down and there's a good reason for it. An alternative to the conventional coffin for burying individuals using mushrooms. A somewhat ridiculous complaint about the issues of having a broken elbow and supposed ableism of computer programming. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with VAERS, or the Vaccine Adverse Events Registry. The simple idea here is that if someone gets a vaccine and at any time in the short period afterwards happens to have something happen to them, well, they can list it. As noted in this particular example, this includes hookers and alcohol. Yeah. This sort of association demonstrates why it is that VAERS is not a reliable means of demonstrating or effectively finding associations between vaccines and anything else. Yes, on a scale, you might be able to say we need to look at this closer, but individually, no. We should be applying the same degree of skepticism to the next study, and that relates to feeding mice aspartame and the fact that they are supposed to be passing on learning deficits to their offspring. The argument and premise behind this study is that if you give aspartame, an artificial sweetener, to male mice, and those male mice reproduce, then their learning deficits and memory issues are passed on. Remember, this is an animal-based study, and we're talking about only giving the sweetener to male mice, so there are all kinds of initial concerns about the design, let alone the fact that, well, it's an animal-based study. The probability of animal-based research translating to human research is very poor at the best of times. The research, other than looking at the nature of the animal and what they were doing, and particularly the sex of the animal, is that they only gave them 50% of the approved daily limit. This doesn't really help very much, largely because it's 15% of the daily limit for humans given to mice, not just 15% of the mice daily limit, as to the best of our knowledge, the FDA hasn't given any such limitation, even when we account for the fact that they adjusted the average human consumption of 4.1 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day to the rodent's body weight. This still significantly leaves a large margin of error between the sheer quantity and volume of a mouse and their mass versus that of a human. There's a big difference between just how much difference a dose intended for a human body versus a mouse body, even when adjusting for gross body weight, can be. The secondary issue to this is that during the reproduction phase of this study, the female mice were also exposed to aspartame containing water. This means that they also received a dose for between 1 and 5 days before they were removed. This raises issues around the impact of aspartame not just on the male mice, but arguably on the female mice, and from that again, the female mice exposure to aspartame while carrying the, effectively offspring. The result of this is that there were 8 male mice in each of the 3 groups, so we are talking a very small study. There were 4 litters from each of the groups, and from each of these they used 1 to 2 male and then 1 to 2 female mice from each of said litters for the analyses. So these are very tiny and arguably incredibly underpowered studies. In a manner of speaking, you could compare this to VAERS. That is, it's an incredibly small sample size and you're trying to extrapolate out the results to something more significant. In this case at least, the mice can't be accused of accessing alcohol, although you could arguably describe the nature of reproduction amongst mice to be that of hookers. In other news that's kind of shoddy, we have an outbreak of gastroenteritis, effectively food poisoning in Australia, and it occurred twice in the same upscale venue. Both times it was thought that the food itself was responsible, but that isn't possible given that the food preparation and, events were temporally separated. That is, there was a significant space between each of them. And this is where things get interesting. It is entirely possible, if not likely, that it was an individual who was a carrier of disease. Very much like Typhoid Mary, as with Typhoid Mary, they effectively contaminated the food, or as a result infected the individuals, because they carried the disease but were asymptomatic. The reason the suspicion falls on an individual carrying the disease and being an asymptomatic carrier at that is that 10% of the individuals at the wedding got sick, and 70% of the individuals at the medical practitioners conference also became sick. So we're not talking about all the people, which detracts significantly from the probability that it's the food itself. And that's simply because if it was the food, then you would expect to see everybody get sick. Conversely, if it was an individual, only the food prepared or handled by that individual would lead to illness. The simplest means of avoiding much of this, and arguably how even a carrier could minimize the risk associated, would be to, wash their hands properly and engage in other hygiene practices. These are the same lessons that, strangely enough, we appear to have forgotten from COVID, which is kind of amazing given that, at least in number of countries, COVID is on the upswing. And as the article from The Guardian points out, that's an issue, as in the UK there are new variants of concern, and that the number of cases is rising. As noted, just with Omicron last year, half of all the UK's population was infected with COVID-19. And given that the Northern Hemisphere is now moving into winter, the rate at which people will be infected goes up. That's because more people spend more time in confined spaces, otherwise known as inside and out of the cold. When this happens, you get more exposure, and importantly, more risk of things like COVID-19, and for that matter, influenza and other respiratory diseases, getting, let's say, suspended in the environment, or contaminating surfaces in enclosed spaces where people then pick up or get infected by said disease and become, sick. From this, they then continue to spread it to other enclosed spaces, and so the issue goes on. This means that particularly in winter, the issue of propagating and, in fact, increasing the infection rate of a disease is more of a concern. When we talk about something like COVID-19, increased hospitalizations, and for those who are vulnerable, such as those who are immunocompromised, deaths is a concern. Given the rate at which asymptomatic carriers of COVID-19 occur, particularly amongst younger populations, this is a concern. Very much like the concern with food handling, and it's because they cannot know they are ill and then spread the disease. Again, though, they can, to a certain extent, mitigate the issue of, infecting others, simply by engaging in good hygiene, covering their mouth when they cough or sneeze, washing their hands. If they think they're ill, wear a mask so that you don't run the risk of infecting others. Relatively minor and not particularly onerous tasks that will greatly reduce the spread of disease. The article also points out some other concerns. One of the more immediate is that, mutations in COVID-19 make it more evasive to the immune system. Mutations also make antibody test kits far less reliable, for exactly the same reason. The antibodies used simply can't detect the mutated version of the virus. There are also issues around, in particular the UK, where the government has rolled back and reduced funding for, the surveillance systems they had in place. That means they have a, less pronounced and certainly not as strong indication of how prevalent COVID-19 is, but also what particular variant of COVID-19 is prevalent. The UK is not the only country where we need to be worried about the increasing number of COVID-19 cases. You have the UK and also the USA. The USA figures are arguably somewhat more concerning, as they have been, let's say, slightly better in recording prevalence. The number of cases of COVID-19 in the US is now approaching the peak of 2020. That is, before we had widespread vaccines, widespread implementation of various measures, including social distancing, masks, and in some instances, lockdowns. This means there is no obvious way to mitigate this at present, at least not without going back to those extreme measures. And the whole reason we know why this is happening? Weirdly enough, wastewater surveillance. It's an, let's say, a previously unpopular method in terms of people weren't very well aware of it, but, it certainly has been embraced, let's say, with regards to COVID-19, as it is a reliable idea that can effectively measure how much of the virus is present, and generally from a much larger area, as most sewage or wastewater doesn't really come from only a single location. You get given a good idea of the overall amount of the disease present. This is why findings that the levels in wastewater are past the peak of the Delta outbreak in late 2021 and very near to and likely to soon surpass the initial peak of March 2020, where the outbreak of COVID-19 effectively began on a scale that led to massive consequences. Just as with the UK, the USA is going to have the same issues when it comes to healthcare. As you increase the number of individuals, whether that is individuals who are immunocompromised or otherwise vulnerable, you get an increase in the number of people who are hospitalized, the number of people who are hospitalized and going to die, a number of people who are hospitalized and will have long-term complications. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be those who are vulnerable. Regular people can, through bad luck or particularly nasty variants, just get hospitalized because they have been infected. So you will have both regular individuals who get ill, those who have no symptoms and are asymptomatic carriers, and those who get severely ill. It's just more likely to be those who are immunocompromised or otherwise vulnerable in this last category. The downside to this is that most governments are increasingly looking to rely solely on vaccines and vaccine boosters. And this is an issue of sorts, partly because, the updated vaccines aren't necessarily current to the variant that's of concern right now. Rather, they're going to likely be tailored to something like the Omicron variant, which is the most recent widespread variant of COVID-19. Now, yes, rolling this out will help and certainly be superior to the original vaccines and the previous boosters that were updated, but it's also not going to be current to the variant of concerns that are emerging, and therefore the immunological defenses and the immunity to the variant will be less. The reliance on vaccines, and particularly boosters, does make some sense, in that they are relatively easy to disseminate to the public, and they are much less expensive and definitively less impactful than more extensive and invasive measures, such as lockdowns, so in that respect they make a lot more sense. But the issue remains, they're not necessarily current. For example, the most recently approved updated version is for Kraken. Kraken made up about 2% of all infections, and it has been decreasingly so since. That means it's targeted towards a largely irrelevant strain now. The other concern is that the current dominant strain is more infectious, and the reason it's more infectious is that it can more effectively and more strongly bind to the receptor that it targets to enter the human cells. Because it can more effectively and more strongly bind to it, it's going to lead to more cases, and that's a simple reality. But that's not the problem necessarily. The problem will be, because this will become the dominant strain, we will now have the next variant not only be more infectious because it's going to rely on, well, this stronger affinity, but it's also likely to have other mutations that make it harder to detect and, importantly, harder to treat. In fact, this last point is one of the major concerns with regards to the Parola variant, which is the next likely variant of concern. It doesn't currently have the increased affinity, but it's likely that it will acquire it or mutate it of its own accord. Next we have an article on the, realities of who did and did not go with COVID-19 vaccination. Now, it is arguably somewhat judgmental, but the gist of it is that cognitive ability, which is a relationship to how smart you are, although that is an oversimplification, related to how much or how well you embrace the idea of COVID-19 vaccinations and the various other health policies that were implemented. It is based on Swedish research, so there is some concern with how well it can be translated to other countries, but then again, it is a very large-scale study using data on more than 700,000 individuals. So there is a much more, let's say, solid foundation to this research and its translatability to elsewhere. The gist of what they found is that there is a positive association, and a very strong positive association at that, between cognitive ability and how quickly someone acted on the availability of vaccinations. They also were able to, take several steps beyond the usual retrospective analyses like this by using a twin design, that is, by looking at those who were twins in the study, or the dataset more accurately. They could look at whether or not there was variability between twins and therefore account for any issues that might come from, say, environment. The results in the end show that, you can simplify the vaccine administration process and largely remove issues of people not taking advantage of its availability by simply booking them in and telling them, this is your appointment. If you want to cancel it or change it, it's on you to do so. Now, the idea behind that is not a crazy novel new idea. Several countries now have a similar method for, organ donation. Spain is one that we are at least aware of and somewhat familiar with, in that Spain has a organ donor registry where you are pretty much automatically signed up to it, and unless and until you tell them no, they keep you on that registry, which has drastically increased the availability of organs, as most people use the rationale of it's too much effort and too much hassle to sign up, so I'm not going to. Whereas those who have a strong or even modest objection to it will take the time and effort to withdraw. The same thing appears to apply here, in that individuals who have a modest or strong objection to the vaccines will actively withdraw themselves or change their appointments, whereas anybody else will simply go, oh, you've done the work for me, I don't need to, great. Yeah, it's one of those things where people are lazy, or at least not motivated, and therefore don't do so. The let's say, major caveat to this research, and it is a fairly major caveat, is that it is a purely retrospective analysis. That is, they have collected data for other purposes and arguably elsewhere. For example, the cognitive element is related to military enlistment, and they then try to look at this and then observe whether or not data from other matching data sets has shown any kind of relationship. You're not necessarily establishing that, yes, one causes the other, only that there may be a tacit relationship between the two, but you really need to prove it with more deliberate and, original research based on actually going into the depths of this and seeing it arguably in real time. But if that's not possible, at least being able to show that if we have this group here, and we know these features of them, have they or have they not utilized it? In other European studies of COVID-19 and interventions, we have a French research publication, although it is worth us pointing out that this is a preprint and has not undergone peer review. So it is, among other things, it hasn't been peer reviewed, so the issues around whether or not it's been evaluated to have the same legitimacy of the other research we've mentioned from Sweden, it definitely hasn't been addressed. The gist of their research is that they were trying to figure out whether or not a lot of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, so basically things that weren't vaccines, really did work the way they were expected to work. The most apparent is going to be lockdowns, but others that could come under the same heading would be social distancing, using masks, and so on. But they really did focus mostly on the lockdown approach. Their results were, rather unsurprising. The transmission was reduced by 84%, and there is a very narrow confidence interval range. That is to say that pretty much it's either going to be between 83 and 85% in just about every instance. So 84% is good enough in that case to say, yeah, just about everywhere they looked, it was 84% effective at reducing transmission, and this is, not that crazy. After all, lockdowns didn't necessarily cover everyone, everything, and everywhere. There is still avenues for infection to happen. There's also the issue around curfews, and they found that, a earlier curfew was much more effective than a later curfew, although this was significantly less effective than just a straight lockdown. This was somewhere around 68% effective, with only slightly wider margins. That is, it was somewhere between 66 and 69%, so again, we're not talking about much range. But this versus the slightly later lockdown at 48% effective. So, if you initiate a curfew at 6 PM, it's 20% more effective than if you initiate it for 8 PM. The interesting element was the transmission from closing schools. Now, school closures are perhaps one of the most controversial elements to this, and what they found, and rather importantly what they found, is that if you closed schools, transmission was reduced by 15%, again with a somewhat narrow range of 12 to 18%, so only 3% each side of the average, which is fairly good. Reducing transmission by 15% on top of other measures like, say, lockdowns, that alone in, let's say, connection to each other would be a 99% reduction in infection. But that's not quite how this works. The results aren't combined. Rather, it's what each individual measure has as an effect. Importantly, from the results that we've described so far, and this is where they go into hypothetical territory, if the vaccine was not available by November 2021, they would have expected to see 194% more deaths and a 340% increase in hospitalizations. If there had been a vaccine available after 100 days, there would have been 71,000 fewer deaths and 384,000 fewer hospitalizations. Just remember, for these last few items, that is purely hypothetical. That is to say, we think this would have been the consequence. It also would have been incredibly optimistic to expect there to be a vaccine within 100 days of the outbreak. However, the rest of the data is significantly more well established and in reality set up in such a way that you can't necessarily argue with this, as it points out, when this change was made, this was the result. It is, however, also a retrospective analysis, so that's a concern with this. In a far more, let's say, realistic and certainly more impactful research, we have the, results of issues around COVID-19 infection and stillbirths, as the publication from the UK describes it, perinatal deaths. Now, to put it in none too delicate terms, perinatal death is the complicated and unnecessarily verbose way of saying the baby dies before it's born, generally somewhere after 24 weeks of age. So the issue here partly is that they do separate out 24 weeks onwards, which is generally speaking the age at which a developing fetus is expected to be able to survive being born early. But also, prior to that, there is issues around just how viable they are, due to issues around organ development and so on. The data that they found was that by taking the 7 years prior to COVID-19, where there were year-on-year reductions in the rate at which mortality occurs, and then looking at the comparison of this time frame to when COVID-19 begins to affect people, the rates go up. And they do use a standardized rate, so note that although these numbers sound low, you effectively have to think about this as times that by the population divided by 1,000. So it's a per 1,000 rate of stillbirths by each region in the UK. Overall, in the UK, it was 3.54 as an increase. But in each individual region, you had 3.52 in England, 3.27 in Scotland, 3.88 in Wales, and 4.09 in Northern Ireland. The increase across the UK was 1.65, but it was 1.6 in England, 1.91 in Scotland, 1.7 in Wales, and 2.46 in Northern Ireland as an increase. Yeah, that is in some cases, more than doubling of the rate. For example, if Northern Ireland increased to 4.09 and it's a 2.46 increase, that means the original rate was somewhere around 1.5. The other issue here is that it's most certainly not limited to just stillbirths or, as that is, perinatal. Rather, there are antepartum stillbirths, neonatal deaths, and intrapartum deaths have all increased, and these all contribute to those numbers. The publication goes into much greater detail on the relationship to the, gestational period, the time frame itself, and so on. And what is particularly noteworthy is that there are notable increases between 22 weeks and 31 weeks, and arguably up to 36 weeks. But after 37 weeks, the impact is, reducing slightly, although that's based on 2021 data, and as you would notice, current year is not 2021, rather it's 2023. If you'd like to undergo a period of disappointment and sadness, you'll find a link to the report below. In further news related to outbreaks of diseases and trying to handle them, we have India and Nipah virus. Nipah virus is yet another virus that largely originates from bats, and it's causing a lot of issues in the southern state of Kerala in India. Although only infecting 6 people, 2 of them have died, and there have been more than 700 people who have had to be tested just in the last week. That's how seriously India is taking the control of this disease. It's also related in some respects to the Hendra virus, which is one of the viruses that's particularly nasty. What this can cause is fever, vomiting, respiratory issues, and then inflammation in the brain. all of these can kill, although largely brain inflammation and respiratory issues are the biggest cause of that. The biggest challenge is that there's no treatment and there's no vaccine to prevent infection. So unlike, say, rabies, where if you're infected you will eventually die, at least for rabies we have a vaccine. Same thing with COVID-19 arguably. The challenge with this is because no vaccine and no treatment, yeah, you get it, and, well, as already noted, 1/3 of individuals infected have died. You have a good chance of being dead in short order. The other issue is that the Nipah virus currently circulating in India is not the same one that was identified in Malaysia in 2001. Rather, this is a new variant. Yeah, it's yet another virus from bats that's mutating rapidly. It's why Batman is not the epitome of justice. In fact, he's not even a symbol of good things. He has taken on the visage of a plague-carrying mammal, effectively a flying rat. The only silver lining of a kind to this whole thing is that the Nipah virus is nowhere near as infectious as something like, say, COVID-19. Only 1/3 of those who are infected will pass it on to someone else. Now for at least slightly more optimistic and promising news that won't make you sad or worried about becoming infected with something nasty. We have a arguably more effective drug than Ozempic for weight loss. Now, this is good news for diabetics who are currently having to fight other individuals who want to lose weight for Ozempic, given the supply has not increased, but off-label prescriptions have increased, therefore more individuals are trying to buy it when the stock availability hasn't increased, which is a big hassle. This new drug is called tirzepatide. This is in some respects a similar sort of drug to Ozempic, in that it's all related to the control of glucose in the body. In this case, it's a glucose-dependent insulin-tropic peptide. This is the complicated way of saying it stimulates release of insulin. Insulin causes the body to take up what glucose is available and store it away. This decreases the amount available to turn into something like, say, fat. It also has a secondary target which it works on, and this is what makes it arguably better than Ozempic. It's a glucagon-like peptide, and this is another way of stimulating insulin, because it targets a different receptor. And because it can target two different receptors, it effectively leads to the release of twice as much insulin, although that's not quite how it's going to work. It's a close approximation. Because these both stimulate the production of insulin, they're going to decrease production of glucagon. Glucagon is the hormone that tells us that we are hungry, or more accurately, there isn't sufficient blood glucose, and therefore we should eat something to raise that blood glucose level. Where this gets useful for those trying to lose weight is the results that diabetics taking this decreased their body weight by between 8.5% and 13%, whilst in comparison to those who would be having a different diabetic hormone used for something similar only lost 7%. So in that respect, at the low end it's only slightly superior, but at the high end it's nearly twice as effective. The research, however, did run over a period of about a year, so we're not going to see any drastic weight loss immediately. Second to that is that there are significantly different doses used for each. For example, the roughly year-long trial of this used 5, 10 and 50 mg doses of tirzepatide, whereas those on semaglutide only had 1 mg doses. So the amount needed to be effective is significantly more. Where this drug may find use for weight loss and not just for diabetes is from a much longer term study of 72 weeks, where individuals lost up to 20% of their body weight, whereas the placebo group only lost about 3% of their body weight. Now, 20% sounds great, and that is the high end. What's interesting is that even at the low end, it was 15% of their body weight. So the amount lost is still comparable, if not significantly more superior to what Ozempic can provide under these same circumstances. Shifting from clinical trial news to what is arguably a case study of a kind, although arguably a case study that's going to have you wincing in discomfort if you have ever been pregnant. A woman was undergoing IVF treatment due to fertility issues. Now, they had a number of embryos implanted, which is pretty much standard practice in some countries, most notably America. The issue with IVF is that, well, IVF is commonly associated with twins being born. This is because the process of fertilization during IVF generally leads to the embryo breaking into two and you get identical twins. But since America undergoes the process of implanting multiple embryos, you get what happened here, a quadruplet pregnancy. The patient was a 32-year-old Caucasian woman with otherwise no notable history. The first IVF attempt failed after 4 weeks, which is unfortunate for them, but then they attempted again 6 months later. They transferred 2 blastocysts. Now, the transfer of 2, as mentioned, is pretty much common for certain countries, although some can use up to 5, which, that would be unfortunate if they were all successful. What happened after this was that at 6 weeks, 2 intrauterine sacs started forming. In theory, each of these contained 2 embryos. So this is all well and good, except that's 2 embryos per sac, not 2 embryos total. That means that there is 4. When you have that many fetuses developing, you get problems around the lack of space, and it can often lead to issues with them, well, just not growing correctly. Fortunately, they were able to find that at the first trimester ultrasound, all of them were anatomically correct, which is great. They then performed appropriate procedures, in this case, cervical circlage, to prevent preterm delivery. At 24 weeks, they prescribed vaginal progesterone to again prevent preterm delivery. In the end, despite all these interventions, a caesarean section was performed at 32 weeks, and this is because the uterus had started to contract and there were other issues. All 4 children delivered were males, which is interesting. In further reproductive news, we may be seeing human trials of artificial wombs very soon. Yeah, this sounds creepy and weird, but it's entirely possible. Only recently, animal trials were conducted and they basically showed that, yeah, it works. Although, the article does describe it in perhaps a rather blasé manner, comparing it to an oversized Ziploc bag. What they are is, well, similar in some respects. What it has is a fluid in there that replaces the amniotic fluid in many respects. The fluid is also pumped in and pumped out via various mechanisms, and in doing so it provides the necessary oxygen and similar. But it also has a connection that replaces the umbilical cord in certain respects. Given the last news item alone, where you had 4 developing fetuses that had to be delivered early, this is one way to, let's say, mitigate early delivery, where the newborn would otherwise be developmentally handicapped or disadvantaged. By transferring them to an artificial uterus, they can make up some of this difference. Those children alone had to wait up to 38 days to be released, which is somewhere around 7 weeks, so roughly on par with normal delivery time. This would allow for something very similar, but just not having to wait and have the children kept in the hospital for 7 weeks necessarily, where they have a constant high-pressure need for care from pediatric nurses, doctors, and so on. The reason we foresee this being tested very soon is that this week the FDA had a meeting where a group of independent advisors met to discuss not only the regulatory but the ethical considerations that any trial of this would need to undertake. And this is something that's, well, going to not just be decided by the group at the FDA. Rather, it's going to be the FDA plus several other experts who are independent that will scrutinize what they've decided. Although we've described one system in place, there are others that have been put forward. One, as mentioned, is effectively a giant sack, which is filled with a quasi-amniotic fluid, whereas another is purely and entirely a, let's say, intravenous system. That is, there is a pump connected to the umbilical cord that moves oxygenated blood into the body via the umbilical cord, a second line out via the jugular vein. There's also a third system that directly injects fluid, particularly amniotic-like fluid, into the lungs. And so the lungs stay open, the blood is pumped around as necessary to oxygenate it, and all of the necessary life support systems are in place. The article goes into more detail on issues, particularly around the problem of caesarean section delivery, but also the ethics of it all. And to be quite blunt, well, we thought that the Matrix was a long way off, but the fetus farms they propose might be a lot closer than we think. And now on to animal and environmental news, and, well, justification for saying that cats are arseholes. At least in America, cats will kill between 1.4 and 3.7 billion birds a year, and up to 20 billion mammals a year. Yeah. That's just how bad it is. Interestingly, and arguably some degree of impressive, at that rate of killing, they've managed to drive 33 species extinct. Going from animal news to arguably genetics, but also technology. It's the creation of a liquid computer. Now, liquid computers themselves are already sounding weird enough, but the contents of the liquid are what make this thing functional. DNA. The DNA acts as a sort of basis or structure upon which the circuits are built. Only recently we mentioned the funding given to the development of a sort of hybrid between neurons and computer chips, but in this case the DNA is integrated directly into a circuit, and this is where it gets kind of weird but also incredibly adaptive and powerful. The DNA itself can form 1 billion or more circuits. The researchers claim up to 100 billion circuits, and each of these circuits can do its own job independently of all of the others. When you think that just running your basic CPU has, say, up to somewhere between 32 and 64 cores, and each of those cores can have its own thread, which means you can double its ability, having just 1 billion circuits running its own thread is impressive. Just remember, though, that DNA computing is unlikely to come to the consumer anytime soon. The other key to this is that not only is it incredibly powerful in that respect, it's incredibly flexible. DNA can, to an extent, adapt and modify itself through either mutations or through the expression of different genes to create a more reliable and adaptive response to the environment. The researchers take relatively short sections of DNA and they integrate these into circuits using chemistry, and the chemistry basically binds them to certain, let's say, gateways. These gate arrays or gateways are then able to be programmed to respond in a certain way. This work is considerably more advanced than some earlier methods using just DNA as data storage. Rather, these can actually execute a function, for example, solving equations. In further combinations of technology and biology, we have Neuralink and its recruitment of individuals for its first in-human clinical trial. The trial is called the PRIME study, PRIME standing for Precise Robotically Implanted Brain-Computer Interface. It's not the most exciting acronym, but it's certainly a lot easier than others that have been made over the years. The clinical trials have been a long time in the making because of what they are and how they are. The FDA has repeatedly gone back to Neuralink and said, we need you to make modifications, review, change, and otherwise develop your protocols for this because we are not satisfied given the nature of what you're going to be doing. And it's because it is practically a first-of-kind implant. It is a completely implantable, wireless brain-computer interface. Whereas most others that have been made, in fact just about all others, have had some sort of wiring involved and had, to a certain extent, external access to the device. This has none of that. Now, you may be thinking, great, I want to sign up, I want to get a brain implant, I want to be the first to have it. But no, unfortunately, it is only open to those with quadriplegia. Further, it has to be caused due to cervical spine cord injury or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. This means that if you're interested, you can't sign up for this trial, but you may be able to sign up to be notified if you are eligible for future clinical trials. Going from the future to examining the human past and an anthropologist's explanation as to why humans like sweet things. Other than the fact that there is the argument that, well, sweetness is an indication of calories, and calories are an indication of happiness, because calories are just shorthand for happiness points, there are other reasons. The anthropologist responsible for this does explain that the reason we've developed a preference for sweet things is similar in some ways. That is, being able to quickly and easily identify how sweet something is gave us a shorthand for whether or not something was calorie-rich. If something was calorie-rich, it was a good idea to be able to pick it up and eat it if we could, or take it with us. As noted within the article, the TACIA2 and 3 genes aren't just found in humans, rather they're found across a wide number of species, whether it's monkeys, cattle, rodents, bats, lizards, fish, and many other animals. This would indicate that either there was a common evolution for this trait a very far way back, or it's such a useful trait that it was evolved independently at different times. Moving to agricultural news of a sort, we have the surprising number of indoor farms that are failing as a business, and why, surprisingly, more are being built despite this failure. The Associated Press explains that at least one business they have as an example that grows lettuce. They've recently opened in Texas, and that what they're trying to do is grow, package, and send out food within 48 hours. This is not to say that every business has been successful. Some have had to file for bankruptcy reorganization, others have literally just said, we have to close due to financial issues. But there are some that are getting increased orders from large companies. For example, in America, Kroger's. They're increasing their availability of what they call vertically grown food, which is just indoor farming. Growing food indoor does have proponents and detractors. Detractors argue that, well, it's an issue. Why are you spending all this money when you have perfectly good land available? Proponents argue that, well, you are going to use less water, certainly use less land, and it means food can be grown close to where consumers are going to be, consuming it. This means you don't need to transport something halfway across the country. There's also an argument that, with the increasing variability of weather, and sometimes extreme weather, due to climate change, growing food indoors means you protect the food from those changes. The biggest barrier from reading the article is likely to be that these companies need to spend a lot of money on energy. The energy is used to power the lights that allow the plants to grow inside. The businesses do argue that they can mitigate this and arguably make their business even more sustainable by using solar power, but even with that in mind, this is still a huge expense, and they are betting on the idea that so long as they sell enough produce all year round, they don't need to worry about the electricity charge because they make enough money to cover it and still profit, along with not having to buy things like pesticide, well, since there are no pests inside the warehouse it's being grown within, they also don't necessarily need weed killer or herbicides, again for the same reasons. But they also can't sell themselves as organic since they use other chemicals that aren't allowed for the nonsensical marketing that has an incredibly hypocritical marketing standard for what is and is not organic, since these are arguably more organic than some of the chemicals used in more conventional farming that says it is organic. It's not just farming of a sort that's hard to do on the scale needed to make itself profitable. Rather, meat that's, well, not from an animal, so effectively cultured or cell-grown meat, is the other major side to this industry that's currently going through a lot of issues. And as one of the members of Upside Foods has said, scaling it to the point where it's not just affordable, but feasible for the company isn't going to be easy, if possible at all. In fact, surprisingly, the demand from the market for cell-cultured meat is surprisingly high, and with what's currently on the market, they are, well, succeeding in terms of selling the meat. The problem is, they can't make enough to meet that demand. That is, they are producing what is effectively cell-cultured meat in the tens of thousands of pounds, although if we're going to use civilized numbers, it's more going to be along lines of 10,000 or so kilograms, yet even that is not enough. Shifting to the final bit of environmental news we have for you, it's the sustainable funeral industry, and in this case, it is a coffin made from mushrooms, or at least a mushroom spore and similar. The idea here is that, well, these will break down very quickly, roughly 2 months or less. And this was supposed to be a more sustainable option than your standard coffin or similar would be. Caskets and coffin are pretty much made from wood, various embellishments, and so on. All of these are nice to look at, and certainly a good way to remember somebody during the funeral itself, but once you bury them in the ground, they take a very long time to degrade and turn into, dirt. This means both the coffin or casket and the individual within take a very long time to eventually turn back into the soil, or is it dust to dust? This is where the invention, let's say, is kind of useful, but also sort of off-putting given that it sounds a hell of a lot like the start of The Last of Us. The invention is to take mushroom mycelium and turn them into the quasi-coffin with hemp fiber. By doing this in a mold, it creates a somewhat attractive-looking casket or similar, but it also, once it's in the soil, degrades very quickly and not only breaks itself down, but also contributes significantly to the decomposition of the individual within. The issues with this are arguably very similar to cultured meat, in that they're currently limited by how much of the material they can grow each month. In this case, growing is literally what's going to happen. Although some of the basis is hemp fiber, they still need the mushroom mycelium to have it work as a, decomposing or degrading coffin. And they can only make 500 a month, and this includes coffins and urns, which are substantially different in size. Shifting to our last few items for this week, we have the politics in New Zealand, and a bizarre and interesting claim from New Zealand's Maori party that the Maori are a genetically superior group. Yeah, whether you want to call it reverse racism or not, it does sound a lot like racism. The claims are based on a series of interviews that have been conducted, and the original research itself isn't, really traceable, so it appears to be a claim based on not really anything substantial. The other issue is that in defense of these claims, the Maori party is saying that they're trying to climb themselves back up from having been oppressed for over a century. Yeah, The Maoris in New Zealand are, yes, a indigenous ethnic group, but they're also one of the few indigenous ethnic groups that were able to reach the treaties of sort, setting themselves up as a distinct group from the colonial individuals, but also importantly, it set them aside and gave them rights that just about all other indigenous groups in colonized countries were unable to get. The degree of oppression they've experienced is arguably minimal, if any. The only evidence that the interviews provide in support of this is the history of what the Maoris have and haven't done, which includes the fact that they've developed things like fishing, hunting, and running, all of which predate anyone arriving in New Zealand. There are other things that they have claimed as their own, which are arguably indigenous sports, but yeah, just about all, let's say, peoples have developed their own individual sports. Look at American football, Australian football, and soccer, just to annoy the Europeans. The other issue is that when you start talking about how one race is superior to another, you open all sorts of doors you don't want to open. And to use a simple example, Maoris may be bigger and stronger than other peoples, but that comes down to certain genes they have. Those same genes contribute to increased risk-taking, increased risks of things like diabetes and heart disease, along with, well, to be quite blunt about it, violence. This is a upside and a downside to every gene in a population. It's the same reason why I say Asiatic individuals have a lower tolerance for alcohol, and in some instances have more issues to do with lactose. Historically, they have selected, due to pressures from their environment, to have certain genes active, less active, or not present at all. You can't just say that because you have certain genes, you are necessarily superior to any other group. This also leads us inevitably to our last story of the week. The article from Nature, which is rather bullshit. It's something of a worry me piece, where it talks about how an individual who broke their elbows, and as a computer programmer realized this actually makes their job really hard. And to be blunt, no shit. When you break your elbows and your job involves the ability to use your hands, yeah, you're going to have trouble doing your job. That's because you have physically made it harder to do your job due to injury. There is no, let's say, deliberate or intended disadvantage to this. It's a nature of the injury. There are other complaints that they present, which are at least somewhat more legitimate, although even these are very weak. It includes things like cryptic documentation, obscure syntax, and confusing error messages. Most people can at least appreciate the confusing error messages side of things, but obscure syntax and cryptic documentation? Not so much. The syntax is there because computers rely on logic, and most people aren't purely logic beings. Therefore, we struggle sometimes to be able to apply pure logic in the circumstances of coding. On the other hand, cryptic documentation often relies on either communication issues or that somebody's just not familiar enough with what they're doing. The further complaints are things like keyboard shortcuts, which, to be clear, they're shortcuts. They're intended to make life easier, but they are not the de facto option. This means that if they're available, great, but not having them does not detract from your ability to do what you are doing. Speech recognition software is exactly the same, a convenience, and if you're not happy with where it is now, start developing your own. And finally, the fact that some of the more popular languages require the use of a mouse and keyboard. Yeah, that's what computers are now. There was a time when you only relied on a keyboard. We've moved on from there, and things are better for it. Claiming that this excludes people with motor disabilities is like saying that because we no longer use manual stick-shift cars, we're disadvantaging those people with two arms. The final egregious complaint is all about the language in use. That is, programming languages are pretty much always in English. Yeah, that's because the computers were developed in English, or the languages since then have been developed in English because it's essentially a evolution of what is available. If you want to go and start your own language in something other than English, you're welcome to do so, again, but this is often a problem because you have to now develop all of that logic and syntax that is in English and find a way to apply it in other languages. As the author themselves notes, this is something that's been done, and as such, their complaint that it's not available enough is, well, frankly, just being something of a, pain in the ass. It's like, oh, no, I want it to be more. Okay, contribute to it. Work towards that. Do something to make it more available. Don't just say it's not enough. This meme perfectly encapsulates that problem. The solutions they propose, other than those already mentioned with simply translating it to a new language, include things like detracting from the consistency and arguably universal nature of coding. In this case, taking away the pretty much typical left to right nature of writing code. The issues around functions such as if and while. All of these exist so that somebody looking at a line of code can understand what's happening. Arguably, even if they don't know what exact variables are, they at least understand enough to go, okay, it says if something. You know that if that thing occurs, even if you don't know what that thing is, it is a requirement for something to follow on. This is why when they complain about the issue of ideas being true or false, and that it's colonized, is just dumb. It's not just dumb, but it completely undermines the fundamental nature of programming and code writing. Code writing is meant to follow a logical process, because if you don't have a logical process, the program will not work. And this is why complaining that it's stemming from strict logic of the 19th century, yeah, that complaint has no meaning. You can't make a computer program work unless you have logic, and unless you have logic that is built on a solid basis of understanding what is going on, and this generally requires a consistency in the terms of reference, you can't have something that's going to achieve what you want. Worse yet, when their solutions that they do propose have the intention of removing clarity. Removing clarity in something like programming is an incredibly bad idea. The final issue with the article is that the author specifically states that they have developed their own language and their own tools, which are intended to answer the issue of ableism of computer programming. Yet they also declare that they have no conflicts of interest or similar. The very fact that you have a competing program or language is a conflict. You have a competing interest that you have advertised in this article. What? That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.